Part 5, February 1775. When Britons first by heaven's command arose from out the azure main. This was the charter of the land, and guardian angels sung this strain. Rule Britannia, rule the waves, Britons never will be slaves. To spread bright freedom's gentle sway, your isle too narrow for its bound, we traced wild ocean's trackless way, and here a safe asylum found. Rule Britannia, rule the waves, but rule us justly, not like slaves. While we were simple, you grew great, now swelled with luxury and pride. You pierce our peaceful, fine retreat, and haste to enslave us with great stride. Rule Britannia, rule the waves, but rule us justly, not like slaves. With justice and with wisdom reign, we then with thee will firmly join, to make thee mistress of the main, and every shore it circles thine. Rule Britannia, rule the waves, but ne'er degrade your sons to slaves. For thee we'll toil with cheerful heart, we'll labor, but we will be free. Our growth and strength to thee impart, and all our treasures bring to thee. Rule Britannia, rule the waves, we're subjects, but we're not your slaves. American words to British patriot song, Rule Britannia. Chapter 17. Here, lad, Mrs. McGuire handed Nathaniel a scrap of paper. Go to the Gazette office, ask that they publish this notice. She started to give him a coin to pay for the advertisement, but held it back to her chest, looking at him pointedly. There will be change. Bring it straight back to me. Yes, mistress, that I will, Nathaniel reassured her. Her eyebrow arched. She placed the coin in his hand and closed his fingers around it. Straight back. Aye. He nodded and scurried out into the street. The household had been in an uproar since John's running off. Every servant was viewed with suspicion. After witnessing how violent Eden could become, all of them were trying to avoid being interrogated by Eden about John's whereabouts. Nathaniel had found the charred remains of a note in the shop's fireplace the morning John disappeared. It read, Eden McGuire, carriage maker, has authorized John Hunter to travel to Richmond to deliver a chaise. The ink was blotted and smeared. John obviously had been trying to forge a pass to get through the slave patrols that kept watch for runaways. He must have thrown this one out to make another, cleaner one. Nathaniel was staring at the note, wondering what to do with it, when Ben came up from behind him. Ben snatched it away. Not thinking of handing that over to Master McGuire, were you? He snapped, without any of his usual good-natured jest. No, Nathaniel was no telltale. But what if Master questions me? What am I to say? If he thinks I know something, like about this pass, he might beat me to know it. With disgust, Ben took a step back from Nathaniel. Then let him beat you. Are you really that weak? I thought you were just shy and mightily abused in your past, Nathaniel. I didn't figure you for a plain and simple coward. He crumpled the paper in his fist. If you tell Eden about this, he'll know exactly where to find John. If John's caught, for each day he's run, a month is added to his indentureship. Capture after a fortnight out, and there's a year more on his bondage. If you tell about this pass, you're locking chains on John. You must stand by friends. Would you also betray me so easily for fear of a harsh word? Ben's voice was full of contempt, his expression the same he might have when tossing kitchen slops to the pigs. Nathaniel hung his head. He just wanted to stay out of trouble, that's all. Why should he stand up for someone else? His own father hadn't protected him. But still, seeing Ben's reaction, he was ashamed. Nathaniel knew his mother would never have placed her own welfare above someone else's, especially someone she cared for. Love bears all things, she'd have said, and Basil had stepped in to save him from the blacksmith without even knowing Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked up at Ben with his eyes full of self-hatred and sorrow. What had he allowed himself to become? For a long, withering minute, Ben glared at him. Then, slowly, as Nathaniel held his gaze, Ben softened. He sighed with impatience. You must learn to stand by your friends, Nat. We must all steel ourselves. After the Continental Congress met, someone drew a picture of a snake cut up into segments. Each segment was named for a colony. Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania. Underneath it, there was a caption. United we stand, divided we fall. It's true. We have to stick together in Eden's shop just as sure as the colonies need to bind fast. John could no longer endure Eden's moods and tyranny, just like the people of Boston. Someday soon they are going to crack under the lobster backs and fight back. When they do, Virginia will follow. I had hoped that John would stay to join in our fight, but he chose to run now to secure his own freedom instead. That's all right. Liberty called him in a different voice than it does me. He was quiet, as if convincing himself not to be disappointed. After a moment, Ben continued, 10 years ago, before he died, my father helped lead Virginians against the Stamp Act. Patrick Henry and Spencer Monroe, the father of my friend James, wrote out a petition protesting the taxes violation of our rights. My father helped them collect signatures to it. He also convinced our neighbors to not purchase anything that carried the British stamp. I was only 6 at the time, but I remember my father risked jail doing so. But it was worth it. By banding together, we forced Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. My father would never run away from trouble, so I won't either. I'm going to stand right here and demand that we be treated justly. We are in the right, no matter how hard the redcoats bear down on us. That's the real mistake the British have made, trying to force us. He closed his eyes and recited, the God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. The hand of force may destroy, but cannot disjoin them. That's what Mr. Jefferson said. I memorized it. Don't you feel it, Nat? Ben seemed very tall suddenly. Nathaniel felt like a worm. The thought of escaping or demanding his release from indentureship had never occurred to Nathaniel. He hated to admit it, but once, no, twice, he thought of freeing himself a completely different way. He thought of throwing himself into the York River to end his misery at the plantation. It was Moses who had seen him on the cliff and called him back. After all the good fortune that had befallen Nathaniel since, that thought now did seem gutless and foolish. Seeing Nathaniel so thoughtful, Ben patted his shoulder. There's a good lad. Ben threw the forged pass into the fire and waited until it turned into a blackened ash that drifted up and out of the chimney. As the paper disappeared in flames, Nathaniel resolved to burn the information it held from his mind as well, making it impossible for him to reveal it no matter what Eden did to him. Ben continued to stare into the flames. That reminds me to visit James at the college. When his father died, James's uncle was able to send him to William and Mary. When my father died, I was sent here to labor for Eden McGuire. He picked up the tongs and began jabbing at the fire. I'll prove that I'm just as good as those who can still afford frilled shirts and new boots. I may only be an apprentice, but I can do my part. Outside on the street, Nathaniel realized he now held another piece of paper that could endanger John. His walk to the Gazette, published by Maria Rhine's family, would be a short one. Right onto the Palace Green, left at Bruton Parish Church, and then just past the courthouse, the magazine, and Mr. Chowning's tavern. The wintry day was bone-chilling, yet Nathaniel slowed to read the notice. Runaway from the subscriber in Williamsburg, an indented servant man named John Hunter, a native of London about 5 feet high, speaks very quick and has a comical, sly, squinting look and a bushy head of hair, had on, when he went away, a dark, drab, short coat. Whoever secures the said servant in any of his Majesty's gaols, so that I may have him again, shall have 10 shillings or 20 shillings for bringing him home. I suspect he may be lurking somewhere about Richmond. E. McGuire. 20 shillings? There'd be many a man who'd hunt John down for 20 shillings. Oh, how Nathaniel wished he could simply lose the note on his way to the newspaper. He stopped abruptly in the middle of the street. Several carts nearly ran over him. If Nathaniel could only purchase John sometime, John could lose himself on the frontier. West beyond Richmond rolled the Blue Ridge's mysterious wilds. That's clearly why John was heading that way. There was little need for wheelwrights in the outpost of Richmond. What would Ben do with this advertisement? He certainly would not stand by idly as Nathaniel would like to. Would he throw it out? Rewrite it? He'd likely do something bold and stupid that would only land them all into a cauldron of trouble. What about Basil? Basil's courage seemed to come out in the face of unkindness. Bringing John back was unkind, wasn't it? Certainly, but how could Nathaniel betray Mistress McGuire, who had been nothing but kind to him? Nathaniel rubbed his forehead with frustration. This was precisely the kind of daunting and dangerous choice he had never, ever wanted to make. He stood agonizing over what to do. quivering with cold and confusion. There was no way that he could avoid delivering the advertisement. If he did, the McGuires would simply write a new one and take it themselves. More than like, no longer trusting Nathaniel with the errand. But Nathaniel finally felt a solution hit him like the February wind. He could at least stop potential bounty hunters from knowing to look for John in Richmond. Breathing hard with nervousness, Nathaniel tore off the bottom of the notice and Eden's suspicion that John was lurking about Richmond. This way, people might start looking for him at Norfolk wharfs or even the borders of North Carolina, giving John enough time to vanish into the mountains. Nathaniel would just pray that Eden wouldn't notice the omission. He refused to think about what would happen if he did. Nathaniel walked on, feeling both strong and absolutely terrified. He had the vague recognition that the decision to help John completely changed the way he navigated the world. Like Gulliver, Nathaniel had stepped onto a foreign land with no familiar compass to guide him. Chapter 18. The Rhind Pinckney, Virginia Gazette was printed in an impressive 2-story brick home. Like many of the houses in Williamsburg, it was rented by the owner to tradesmen who lived and worked their craft in the same building. As he knocked on the door, Nathaniel heard voices and the thumps and bumps of business being done inside. Maria opened the door. She blushed when she saw Nathaniel, who stood gawking and silent, letting the cold air rush through the door to rattle Maria's skirts. When he realized she was shivering from the frigid blast, Nathaniel reached up to tip his round hat as he'd seen gentlemen do in respect to ladies in town, but instead he knocked it off his head to her feet. Terrified it would blow away, he dove for it, nearly tackling her. When he popped back up, hat in hand, they almost cracked heads. A brood of children saved him from his embarrassment by suddenly emerging from inside, crying, "Who is it? Who is it?" A subscriber?" Maria provided Nathaniel's answer. "Yes, miss, I've brought a notice from the McGuires. One of their servants has run off." "Goody!" The littlest one clapped his hands and danced about. Maria shushed him and reddened again. Nathaniel guessed that her family was having money difficulties as well. With 5 young orphan children to care for, Maria's cousin, John Pinckney, had his hands full. Nathaniel knew that a number of people rented rooms in the house to cut some of the family's housing costs. He wondered, too, if the paper's strong voice for freedom was losing them readers. "Come in," said Maria. "There's still time to set type for this issue." Nathaniel followed Maria into a room crammed with tall, wide printing presses and stacks of paper. There, her cousin Pinckney, an apprentice a few years older than Nathaniel, and a slave, were preparing the Thursday Broad Street. Pinckney was pulling out individual letters from rows and rows of tiny lead squares in a compartmented wooden box. One by one, he placed them along a long iron ruler. He squinted as he worked. When Nathaniel drew closer, he could see why. The letters were no bigger than a black carpenter ant, and backward. Seeing how puzzled Nathaniel looked, Pinckney laughed. "It is confusing having words in reverse. I must lay out the entire sentence like that, backward, spelling a word like the as EHT. That's because when we press the paper down onto the galley, the printing reverses the image. I really have to mind my PS and my QS because they appear almost identical reversed." He wiped his inky hands on his apron and reached for Nathaniel's note, obviously glad for a break. "Ah, perfect. I had a hole in this column. I'll place your notice in between the one about a strayed horse and the one about a found slave." Pinckney counted up the letters and spaces in the notice. "Maria, can you take care of payment, please?" "Yes, of course." She gestured for Nathaniel to follow her into the next room, which was filled with books and pamphlets for sale. "That will come to 3 bits, Nathaniel." She caught herself and blushed. "Is it all right if I call you Nathaniel?" Maria's dark, soulful eyes met Nathaniel's. "Oh my," she whispered, probably not realizing she spoke aloud. "What beautiful eyes." Nathaniel felt like telling her she could call him by whatever name she wanted, but instead he cleared his throat and stammered out, "Yes." Her smile was sweet. "You may call me Maria, then." Nathaniel ducked his head and stuck out his hand with a coin, hot and sweaty from his nervousness. Maria weighed it and cut the coin in quarters, giving back 1 triangle slice to Nathaniel. "Thank you, Miss, Maria." Nathaniel began to back out of the room, squishing the brim of his hat. "Would you like to see your notice laid out?" Maria stalled his departure. Nathaniel nodded. They entered the press room again. By now, one of the pages was completely composed in a frame. The apprentice was applying ink to the type by beating the laid-out letters with leather balls stuffed with wool on sticks that he smeared with black ink. Pinckney wasn't quite finished laying out Eden's notice. "Your master always writes long," he commented. "A year or two ago he had quite a battle with an old journeyman of his in our newspaper. I remember a lot of name-calling and a challenge between them to make a carriage and then let the public pick the best. A contest to decide who was the better artisan. But nothing came of it, as I recall. A bit of a hothead, is he not?" Nathaniel didn't know what to say. Criticize his master in public? He might risk punishment to help John, but gossiping about Eden was simply foolhardy. Maria frowned at her cousin and changed the subject. "Here, Nathaniel, I have learned to read backward. I can tell you what this notice says if you like." Nathaniel nodded, grateful to avoid answering about Eden. Let's see, she puzzled a moment. DETTIMMOC, committed to the public jail, YAWANUR, runaway. Wait a moment, watch this, it's like magic. She reached under the counter on which Pinckney worked and pulled out a small mirror. She positioned it to reflect the type now reading forward in the mirror. Slowly, for she was not a fluid reader, she spoke, "Committed to the public jail. A runaway slave named Moses. Says he belongs—" "Wait, did you say Moses?" Nathaniel's heart started to beat wildly. In America, there were many Africans named Moses, he knew. But could this be his friend? He fought the desire to grab the mirror from Maria. "Yes," she nodded. "Please," he urged. "Please read the rest." "A runaway slave named Moses. Says he belongs to a plantation in Surrey County on the James River, but will tell no more. He is unusually tall, close to 6 feet, very muscular and strong." Yes, that's right, thought Nathaniel, incredibly strong. On his forehead is a scar shaped like a crescent moon. Nathaniel gasped. It had to be Moses. He snatched the mirror from Maria to finish. A scar shaped like a crescent moon, had on when he was taken up by a mint-colored broadcloth cloak, double-breasted scarlet waistcoat, and a pair of buckskin breeches. Nathaniel remembered those clothes. They were Moses's Sunday clothes. His owner desired to apply for him, pay charges, and take him away. Peter Pelham. Peter Pelham. That meant Moses was in the Williamsburg jail. Nathaniel managed to shove the mirror back into Maria's hand before he was out the door running. Williamsburg jail was a grim place. On the opposite side of town from the McGuire's home, just north of the Capitol, the prison was surrounded by a tall brick wall. Within the exercise yard behind it, pirates, thieves, murderers, debtors, and runaways might be let out of their cells to walk for a few minutes, their view limited to the red bricks holding them in, the filth and dirt at their feet, and the sky above. Until recently, the insane had been housed there too. Their screams and pleas for mercy, or to the phantoms that plagued them, pierced Nicholson Street, strangely mixing in with the everyday sounds of passing carts, cows, gardening, and the conversation among neighbors. Attached to the prison was a 2-story house. There lived the jailer, the acclaimed organist of Bruton Parish Church, Peter Pelham, with his wife and their flock of children. Pelham regularly took a prisoner to church to pump the bellows that operated the organ while he played. It was to his front door that Nathaniel ran. A sour smell of sewage, trampled mud, and rotting garbage hung about the place. Mrs. Pelham answered Nathaniel's knock, balancing a baby on her hip and soothing a sniffling toddler clinging to her apron. "Please, ma'am," Nathaniel asked, panting from his run, "you hold a slave named Moses. May I speak to him, please?" With a weary face, Mrs. Pelham looked him over. "Have you come from his owner to claim him? You'll want more strength than is in you, child, to get him back to his master. He put up quite a fight when the sheriff brought him in." "No, ma'am, I'm just a friend." He blurted out the word. Mrs. Pelham frowned. Nathaniel realized too late that whites were not supposed to be friends with slaves, especially one who had run away and caused trouble for the jailer. But he sensed compassion in her. "I used to work with him before. We spent a great deal of time together then." "Where do you belong now?" "To Basil." He corrected himself. "I work in Eden McGuire's shop." "The governor's carriage maker?" Nathaniel hesitated, not knowing whether that bit of information would help or harm his hope to see Moses, but there was no way around the answer. "The carriage maker. Aye, mistress," he muttered. Mrs. Pelham nodded, seemingly impressed. "Up! Want up!" the small child whined, holding his hands toward her. She sighed and somehow managed to gather him up and balance him on her other hip. I'm not sure that Mr. Pelham would allow this, but he's at the church right now. Come, I will leave you with them for a few minutes. I've my young ones to tend to. When I come back, though, you must leave straight a ways. Nathaniel followed her out of the wintry sunlight, through a large room, downstairs into darkness. He put his hand along the wall to steady himself, and felt dampness and moss growing along it. Here the rascal is. Mrs. Pelham put down her children, who both began wailing, to pull a large key off the wall. She unlocked a heavy wooden door. Nathaniel gasped. Inside, lying face down on straw, was Moses, chained to the wall by leg irons. He is too strong, Mrs. Pelham said softly. He needed to be contained. She handed Nathaniel a bowl filled with a nasty-smelling salve of turpentine oil. His face and arms are bruised. I was afeard to try putting it on his cuts. Mayhap he'll let you. She disappeared, carrying her infants, their cries escorting her retreat. Nathaniel tiptoed in, more out of fear of the place than of making noise. Moses, he whispered, it's Nathaniel. Wake up, Moses. Moses lifted his head. Nathaniel bit his lip to keep from crying out in dismay. Moses' eyes were nearly swollen shut, they were so bruised. His mouth was split open on one side. There was no recognition in his bloodshot eyes. Moses, don't you know me? It's Nathaniel, from the York River. Moses looked at him blankly. Let me put this balm on that cut, Moses. It wants physic to heal. Nathaniel scraped up a dollop of the sticky salve and spread it on Moses' chin. Nathaniel? Moses finally spoke in a raspy voice. Aye, Moses, what happened? Why did you run away? I could not stand bondage no more, Nathaniel. I could not. My new master teach me to pilot boats up and down the James River and into the Chesapeake Bay. He were kind enough, but the hours on the tides, they spoke to me. You feel so free on the waters, Nathaniel. That river comes and goes, pulling, going the way it wants, and on the bay I could see to the ocean and the way to my homeland. If the waters have their own mind, why can I not? Moses was sitting up straight now, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. There was a good woman among us, name of Lucy. She finished what you start. She taught me to read, Nathaniel. She's a slave too, but she lived in Williamsburg when we were young. Her master sent her to the Bray School, where they learned black children, free and slave, to read. So she been teaching me. She used the good book to learn me, Nathaniel. I learned about Moses, the man my mama called me for. I learned how he show up the Pharaoh and set his people free. Why didn't you tell me about Moses, Nathaniel? Nathaniel hadn't even connected his friend with the biblical hero. Perhaps in those days, when Nathaniel was so sad, so beaten down, he couldn't contemplate the Old Testament story of escape and salvation. I'm sorry, Nathaniel said, although as he looked at Moses in chains, he wondered if his friend had been well served by the knowledge. Moses, Nathaniel choked out the words, did your master do this to you? Nay, Nathaniel, it was the slave hunter, a foul man I pray God punishes. Nathaniel looked about the cell. All it held, besides the chains and the straw, was a bucket of water. A barred, open window let in a trickle of sunlight and an ocean of cold. He began to shiver, a chill washing into his bones and heart. Cold, boy? Moses asked. You never was hardy enough. He tried to reach out to rub circulation back into Nathaniel's arms, but his chains clattered and stopped him. But you look better than when we was parted, Nathaniel. Where you be? In ease and luxury by comparison, Nathaniel thought. He was suddenly flooded with unchecked gratitude toward Basil. And wasn't it just like Moses as he lay locked in prison to worry over Nathaniel? He told Moses about Basil and Eden. Moses nodded pleased. Near the governor's palace, you say? Yes. How close? One house down, before you reach the brick house belonging to Mr. White. Moses thought a moment, as if memorizing the location. Moses, what will happen to you now? They take me back. What then? Moses shrugged. 20 lashes for the last man what run, that's all. That's all? Nathaniel gasped. Moses smiled and then winced, holding up a hand to his battered mouth. A lash may cut my skin, but it can't hurt me no more, boy. Not now my mind be free. Footsteps approached. Mrs. Pelham appeared. I've just been told that his master is sending for him tomorrow. Best say your goodbyes. Nathaniel fought off sudden, childlike tears. He struggled to ask, Can I do something for you, Moses? But he knew there was no helping Moses here today. But in the tomorrows ahead, surely those calling for liberty for themselves would think to include slaves like Moses in their cause. If patriots took up the fight, if Moses could stand bondage until then. Moses shook his head. He gestured to Nathanael to come closer and whispered in his ear, "The Lord will show us the way to the promised land. I'm going to follow. You do too." That night, without warning, without quite realizing what he was doing, Nathanael caught up to Basil and hugged him around the waist from behind, darting away again out the door to the horses before he could see the old man's joy.